One of the great questions that you could ask as a philosopher is, what's it like to be a baby? What is childhood experience actually like? And some philosophers over the ages have acted as if, well, babies aren't the sort of things that people who would have much experience, having consciousness is something that's reserved for adults. But I think that actually there's good reason to believe that children have in some ways more consciousness than adults, but their experience of the world is really different from the experience of adults. And one way to think of it is that adult attention is a lot like a spotlight. That's an idea that psychologists have had for a long time. So when we pay attention to something, the thing we attend to becomes really vivid and we're very conscious of it. And everything else gets shut out. We can show literally something called inattentional blindness. We stop seeing the things we aren't paying attention to. Whereas for children and babies, that it's a very different story. Children seem to have a much broader focus of attention. When we say that children have trouble paying attention, what we really mean is that they have trouble not paying attention. So rather than just being focused on one thing with everything else in the dark, instead they seem to be extracting information from everything that's going on around them. It's as if their attention is more like a kind of lantern going out and taking information from the world than a spotlight just illuminating one specific relevant fact out in the world.
Have you been able to discern which is a more effective way to learn, by using the spotlight or the lantern?
Well, one of the big ideas that I've been working on recently is the idea that there are intrinsic trade-offs between different ways of being intelligent, different ways of being in the world. And I've been doing a lot of work with people in artificial intelligence. I'm part of the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence research group. And they point to a tension between what they call exploration and exploitation. So the idea is the kind of things you need to do to act effectively in the world, to go out, to make plans, to make things happen, to get what you want. Those are very different from the kinds of things you need to do if what you want to do is learn, explore, find out as much as you can about the world. And there's even proofs that those two things are in intrinsic tension. You can't both be a great learner and a great explorer and a great exploiter, a great actor at the same time. And what I've been arguing is that childhood is really evolution's way of resolving that. So as adults, that spotlight of attention is very useful if we want to actually get things done. But having this broader, more exploratory attention when we're children actually helps us to learn more about the world around us. And then we can take all those things that we've learned and put them to use in adulthood. Now, it has some drawbacks. If you've ever tried to get a 2-year-old to put their jacket on if you're trying to get to childcare, there's times when you would be very happy if they had a more focused attention. But it reflects the fact that what their agenda, as it were, is learning, figuring out about the world, not acting on the world.
Well, let's go halfway in between. Not childhood, not adulthood, but adolescence. And I have read quotes of yours which suggest that the human brain becomes a lean, mean acting machine at that time of life. How so?
Well, it's been sort of fascinating. We did a bunch of experiments that showed that when you have these kind of exploratory tasks, very young children, 4 or 5-year-olds, are actually better at those tasks than adults. And then we wanted to see, well, what happens in between? And what we discovered was that there's a really striking change in adolescence. So if you give someone a task that has to do with the physical world, how a machine works or how an object works, then what you see is that around adolescence, you see this shift from this very broad exploratory kind of behavior and thinking to something that's much more focused. But interestingly, if you give them a social task, something about how people work, not how objects work, then you see the opposite. Then you see that the adolescents actually become really flexible again, very much what neuroscientists call plastic. And that fits with what we know from neuroscience, that especially social areas of the brain seem to have this kind of rebirth of plasticity and flexibility in adolescence. And that suggests that adolescents might be especially designed to explore social problems in the social world. And that's consistent with the fact that adolescents are often on the cutting edge of a social change. So again, it's this idea that there are trade-offs, different kinds of things that people do differently at different stages of life, all the way from childhood to adolescence to adulthood to elderhood, which is something that I've gotten very interested in. And they're different kinds of strengths and weaknesses at each of those stages of life.
All right. If we adults use the spotlight then to learn, and if younger people tend to use the lantern and have a more diverse way of looking at things, Does that mean children are, in some respects, more conscious than adults, since they're able to take in, apparently, a much broader panoply of a landscape?
Well, what I've argued is that if you try and think about consciousness, think about just, the intensity of experience, it seems to be connected to this kind of learning and plasticity. So when we get really, really good at doing something, we do it over and over again, we actually become less conscious of what we're doing. And it's in those early phases where we're exploring that we have the most vivid consciousness. And a metaphor I've used is, for example, if you think about traveling to a foreign place where you don't have all your practice schemes in mind, you're actually more conscious of what's going on around you than you are when you're home and you're doing the same things that you do very effectively and efficiently. So I think that experiences like foreign travel may give us a hint of what it's like to be a child. And if that's true, when children don't know anything to begin with, are learning everything anew, then what you might expect is to actually have more of this vivid conscious experience than grown-ups. And I think anybody who's spent time with a small child, that will ring true, right? So, you walk down the same street that you walk down every single day, and most of the things there are invisible. When you go down to the corner to get a quart of milk, take that same walk with a 3-year-old, and it's like going to get a quart of milk with William Blake. It's suddenly everything you realize, wait a minute, there's airplanes in the sky, and there's paper on the sidewalk, and there's gates that creak back and forth. So I think this actually does fit with some of our experience of children's experience.
So would it be appropriate then to conclude that the most highly creative kind of thinking happens more with the lantern as opposed to the spotlight?
Well, of course, if you're thinking about adult creativity, one of the things that's challenging about adult creativity is that we have to have both. So we have to go back and forth between the ability to explore lots of possibilities, and then out of all those possibilities, pick the ones that are really good, pick the ones that are really useful. If you, again, spend some time with a 3-year-old, you'll hear these wonderful, strange ideas, but most of them are not actually going to be very useful out in the world or very accurate. And the job for an adult person who's creative, like a scientist, for example, is first to generate all those ideas, first to do the exploration, and then to narrow in and pick, say, which of these is worth exploring, which of these would make a good experiment. One of the things that I've been thinking about recently is if you just collect all these wonderful things that toddlers say, 3 and 4-year-olds say, there used to be a television program called Kids Say the Darndest Things. And what you hear is these things that are both, on the one hand, incredibly creative and almost always completely wrong. I had a lovely example of this the other day. We have the Campanile, which is a big clock tower at Berkeley. And one of my students, 3-year-olds, was walking past it and looked up at it and said, "There's a clock very, very high up. They must put it there so that the children won't break it," which is... of course, it's true. It's weird to have a clock up at the top of a tower. Why would you do that? And why would you put it there? Well, it's a pretty good hypothesis that you have it there so the children won't be able to break it. But not one that no grown-up would come up with, but actually not one that's terribly accurate.
It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion, though, if you're 4 years old. Yeah, it is.
Exactly.
Well, yeah. Is there a way for adults to experience the lantern? How do we do that?
Yeah, I don't think adults ever quite have the kind of broad consciousness and creativity that say 4-year-olds do. But I think one of the great things about adulthood, about humans in particular, is that we can shift back and forth between this kind of more creative childhood lantern state and the more focused kind of spotlight state. And as I mentioned, some of the things that we kind of know are good for creativity, like doing something new, challenging yourself with a new skill, being in a new place. I think a number of forms of meditation have this same kind of character. So oddly enough, just, sitting in one place and not being in the world of planning and thinking and trying to get things done that we usually are, that can help us to kind of reconstruct that much broader sense of awareness of everything going around us. And there's at least some evidence that also helps us to rethink our problems, have different attitudes, change what we do. So, the moral is don't go do something, just sit there. And sometimes just sitting there like those sort of useless 3-year-olds is a way that we can reset our understanding of the world.
Well, apropos of that, I have talked to astronauts in the past who say that first view they take of Earth, where they can see the Earth from with a view that nobody else in this world gets to see, is that sort of an adult enjoying the lantern view of things?
Well, in people in spiritual traditions talk about the numinous. So that's a lovely word that I like to capture that sense that we have of the world is much bigger than we think, and we're much smaller than we think. And there's actually beautiful work that my colleague Dacher Keltner has done about the experience of awe. And the experience of awe is when, it would be great if we were astronauts, but even for those of us who aren't astronauts, just, seeing a redwood tree or seeing something that's bigger and more significant than we are. That seems to be one way that adults get back into that childhood state. And one thing that I think is worth saying about it is it's easy to think about those states of consciousness like awe or the numinous or meditation as if they were kind of weird, right? These kind of strange hallucinations we have. But I think there's a pretty good argument that that's when we're actually seeing the truth about the world. And our usual sense that we have this self that's incredibly important, that's going out and doing things, and what it's doing is the most important thing in the world. That's the hallucination. That's the illusion. It's a very useful hallucination because if we didn't think, okay, I have to, get onto the agenda with Steve at 10 o'clock this morning, our things wouldn't work as well. But it is sort of an illusion compared to the sense that we have when we're staring up at the redwood tree, that the world is much bigger than just our individual selves.